Maverick Knight was a man who rarely entertained distractions. At 39, he had conquered industries, built empires, and accumulated more wealth than entire families could dream of for generations. He was used to being in control. His boardrooms were silent when he entered. His rivals were crushed without mercy, and women adored him, though he gave them little more than fleeting moments. What he never did, however, was entertain the idea of black women. Not as friends, not as lovers, not as anything beyond a passing glance in the sea of humanity. It wasn't that he openly hated them. It was worse. He dismissed them. Somewhere deep in the corridors of his upbringing, he had inherited a prejudice that told him they were not his kind of women. They were not his type. They did not belong in his world. And so, his life had carried on in its neat, orderly rhythm. Until that night. The rooftop of the Avalon Grand Hotel was bathed in gold. Thousands of fairy lights draped across trellises, crystal chandeliers hung over velvet lounges, and a jazz quartet filled the air with smooth melodies. The city skyline stretched in the distance like a painting, sharp skyscrapers piercing the dusk with the river glittering below. It was Arthur Langston's 50th birthday, and Maverick had come out of courtesy more than pleasure. Arthur was a fellow billionaire, an old friend from the Harvard days, and his parties were always extravagant showcases of power. Guests mingled in tailored tuxedos and sequined gowns, laughter ringing out as champagne glasses clinked. Maverick stood near the balcony, a glass of scotch in hand, his piercing blue eyes scanning the crowd with casual detachment. He had already exchanged pleasantries with a senator, turned down 2 offers from investment bankers, and endured a conversation with a model who only seemed interested in his yacht. It was all routine, predictable, ordinary, until he saw her. She entered like a vision. The first thing Maverick noticed was the gown, sleek, deep purple satin that hugged her curves effortlessly, shimmering under the soft glow of the chandeliers. Then came her poise, regal, confident, every step as though she owned the ground she walked on. And finally, her face, delicate features, luminous dark skin, and eyes that carried both warmth and an undeniable strength. Maverick froze. Something shifted inside him. Something he couldn't immediately place. He wasn't a man easily shaken, but his heartbeat betrayed him, pounding harder with each second she moved closer into the room. He told himself to look away. Old habits whispered in his ear. Not her. Not your kind. But his eyes refused. They clung to her like iron to a magnet. Who is she? Maverick muttered under his breath. No one around him seemed to notice her the way he did. Conversations continued, glasses clinked, the music swelled. Yet for Maverick, the entire party had blurred into silence, leaving only her. She made her way to the bar, ordered something with a smile, and leaned against the counter, alone. Maverick downed the rest of his scotch, straightened his tuxedo jacket, and forced his feet forward. For the first time in years, he felt nervous. "Good evening," he said when he finally reached her. His voice, usually deep and commanding, came out just a shade uncertain. She turned to him, eyes flicking over his face, her lips curving into a polite but measured smile. "Good evening." Up close, she was even more stunning. Her hair was swept into an elegant bun, a pair of diamond earrings catching the light with each tilt of her head. There was no trace of intimidation in her gaze. If anything, she looked as though she was weighing him, deciding whether he was worth her time. "I don't think we've met," Maverick said, extending his hand. "Maverick Knight." Her brow arched slightly, as though recognizing the name. Still, she didn't gush or feign excitement the way most people did when meeting him. Instead, she took his hand with calm confidence. "Pheobe Bernard," she replied. Pheobe. The name rolled through him like velvet. "Pleasure to meet you, Pheobe," Maverick said, releasing her hand reluctantly. "Arthur certainly knows how to throw a party." "He does," she agreed, glancing around the rooftop. "Though I've never been one for all this glitter. Too much sparkle makes it hard to see what's real." Maverick blinked. No one ever said things like that at these gatherings. Most people were too busy pretending to belong. Her words were refreshing, grounded. He found himself smiling, genuinely smiling. I couldn't agree more. These events are a performance. Her lips twitched upward. And what role are you playing tonight, Mr. Knight? For a second, Maverick was caught off guard. No one spoke to him like that. Teasing, almost challenging. Women usually bent themselves to fit his ego. But not her. I suppose I'm playing the bored billionaire, he said dryly. And you? The observer, Pheobe replied smoothly, sipping her drink. I like watching people pretend. It tells you more about them than their words ever could. He chuckled, his interest deepening. You're not like most people here. And you're not as charming as you think you are. She shot back lightly. Maverick laughed. Actually laughed. A sound that startled even him. What began as a hesitant introduction blossomed into a conversation that carried them through the evening. They spoke about travel, books, music. She told him about her love for architecture, the way cities were shaped not just by buildings but by the dreams of the people inside them. He found himself listening, truly listening, not simply waiting for his turn to speak. And he surprised himself too, sharing small pieces of his life that he rarely gave away. The pressure of his empire, the loneliness of success, the walls he had built so high even he sometimes couldn't climb them. With anyone else he would have guarded those truths like secrets. With her the words flowed. As the night waned and guests began to leave, Maverick realized something alarming. He didn't want the conversation to end. I enjoyed talking to you, Pheobe, he said softly, reluctant to break the moment. She smiled, her eyes warm but unreadable. I enjoyed it too. He hesitated, then reached for his phone. Would you mind if I had your number? Perhaps we could continue this conversation another time, away from all the sparkle. There was a beat of silence as she studied him. Maverick felt a strange tension in his chest, as though waiting for a verdict. Finally she nodded and recited her number. When he saved it, something inside him clicked. A door opening. Later, as Maverick sat in the back of his black Rolls-Royce, the city lights flickering past the tinted windows, he stared at her name glowing on his phone screen, Pheobe Bernard. He should have been annoyed with himself. This wasn't him. He didn't chase women, didn't get distracted, didn't let his guard down. Especially not for someone who represented everything he once dismissed. And yet, he leaned back against the leather seat, loosening his tie. For the first time in years, the world felt unpredictable. And strangely, he liked it. The billionaire who had never once entertained the idea of loving a black woman had just spent the night utterly captivated by one. And he couldn't shake the feeling that his life had just changed forever. Maverick Knight wasn't easily impressed. He had met queens, presidents, tech geniuses, and world-renowned artists. Yet the morning after Arthur Langston's birthday party, as he sat in his penthouse office staring at the skyline, his mind refused to let go of one name. Pheobe Bernard. He had typed it into his phone out of habit, but he hadn't stopped there. Curiosity gnawed at him. Who was she really? A woman that poised, that intelligent, that confident. She had to be more than just another party guest. His assistant Peter knocked and entered carrying the day's agenda. Maverick was barely listening until Peter casually added, "Oh, and Richard Bernard's daughter will be at the corporate summit tomorrow. Shall I prepare your briefing?" Maverick's head snapped up. Wait, Bernard's daughter? Yes, Peter said, surprised at his sudden interest. Pheobe Bernard. She's the managing director of Bernard Global. She runs most of the company's operations now while her father focuses on investments. Maverick leaned back in his chair, a slow smile creeping across his face. Of course. Richard Bernard was a titan, one of the few men in business Maverick respected without question. And Pheobe, his daughter, wasn't just elegant and beautiful. She was powerful, accomplished, a woman who carved her own path instead of standing in anyone's shadow. It wasn't infatuation anymore. It was admiration. The next evening, Maverick arrived at the corporate summit. It was held at the Crystal Pavilion, a vast hall of glass and steel filled with the hum of the nation's most influential leaders. Maverick was accustomed to commanding attention wherever he went, but this time, he found himself searching the crowd for just one face. And then he saw her. Pheobe stood near the exhibition displays, her hair in soft curls that framed her face, her charcoal suit tailored to perfection. She exuded authority, every gesture calm, every word deliberate. She wasn't just present, she was leading. Maverick watched as a group of younger executives clustered around her, listening intently as she explained a new expansion strategy for Bernard Global. Her confidence was magnetic. He approached when the crowd dispersed. "Ms. Bernard," he greeted, this time with a tone of deliberate respect. Her lips curved into a knowing smile. "Mr. Knight, twice in 1 week. People will start to think you're following me." "Perhaps I am," he said smoothly. "Or perhaps we move in the same circles, and fate is simply doing me a favor." Pheobe chuckled softly, but her eyes narrowed with amusement. "You don't believe in fate, Maverick. You believe in control." That stopped him. She was right. It was something he had confessed during their first conversation, a rare glimpse into his guarded world. How had she remembered so easily? "I'm beginning to think you're far more dangerous than you look," Maverick said. "And I'm beginning to think you're not as untouchable as you pretend," Pheobe replied. Over the weeks that followed, they began to meet more often. At first it was under the pretense of business, lunches where they discussed mergers, dinners where they debated market trends, quiet afternoons in her office where she showed him Bernard Global projects in sustainable energy. But somewhere between the contracts and the charts, friendship bloomed. Maverick found himself laughing more with Phoebe than he had with anyone in years. She teased him without fear, challenged his opinions, and occasionally ignored his calls just to remind him he wasn't the center of her universe. He admired her work ethic, her discipline, her refusal to coast on her father's reputation. And she in turn admired his ambition, his relentless drive, and the rare glimpses of vulnerability he allowed her to see. For the first time, Maverick felt like he wasn't just admired for his wealth or power, he was seen. But the world around them wasn't so forgiving. At a private dinner one evening, Maverick's longtime business partner, Charles Wentworth, leaned across the table with a smirk. "I hear you've been spending quite a bit of time with Richard Bernard's daughter." Maverick didn't flinch. And, Charles drawled, swirling his wine. "Surely you know what people are saying. A man like you with, well, a woman like her. It doesn't exactly fit the picture." Maverick's jaw tightened. "And what picture is that?" "You know what I mean," Charles said carelessly. "Society has expectations. Investors have expectations. Don't complicate things by mixing personal with—" "That's enough," Maverick cut him off, his voice like steel. Charles leaned back, startled by the intensity in his eyes. But Maverick was done listening. That night, as he drove home, anger churned inside him. Not at Pheobe, but at himself. Because deep down, he knew Charles was only voicing what Maverick himself had once believed. The prejudice he thought buried was still alive, waiting to whisper doubts. The breaking point came 2 weeks later. They were attending a charity gala, another glittering event filled with polished smiles and sharp whispers. Maverick escorted Pheobe inside, their entrance turning heads. She looked breathtaking in a navy gown, her hand lightly resting on his arm. For most of the evening, everything was perfect, until a socialite half-drunk and reckless sneered loud enough for Maverick to hear. Is he serious? Maverick Knight parading around with her? Must be a phase. He'll come to his senses soon enough. The word sliced through the air. Maverick stopped in his tracks. Pheobe, sensing the tension, squeezed his arm gently, her eyes urging him to ignore it. But he couldn't. He turned, his voice cutting through the hall like a blade. If you have something to say about the woman I'm with, then say it to me directly. Otherwise, keep your ignorance to yourself. The room fell silent. Eyes turned. The socialite stammered, red-faced before slinking away. Maverick looked around, daring anyone else to speak. No one did. When he turned back to Pheobe, her eyes were wide, not with fear, but with something softer, something warmer. "Why did you do that?" she whispered once they were alone on the terrace. "Because you deserve respect," he said simply, "and because I refuse to stand by and let anyone reduce you to less than who you are." Phoebe's gaze softened. For the first time she reached up and touched his face, her fingers brushing his jaw. "You're changing, Maverick Knight, and I don't know whether to be impressed or terrified." He caught her hand gently, holding it against his cheek. "Be both." From that night on, their bond deepened. They spent weekends walking through art galleries arguing about which pieces carried true genius. They drove out of the city for long, quiet dinners where no one knew their names. Maverick began to open up about his childhood, the cold household, the expectations that smothered him, the loneliness money never erased. And Phoebe shared her own battles, the pressure of living in her father's shadow, the constant need to prove she wasn't just his daughter but her own force, the subtle racism she endured in boardrooms where her brilliance was overlooked until she shoved it in their faces. They found solace in each other. They found understanding. And slowly, Maverick realized something startling. The walls he had spent years building were crumbling, one by one, under the steady warmth of her presence. By the end of the season, there was no denying it anymore. They weren't just colleagues, they weren't just friends, they were something more. Maverick knew it the moment he kissed her for the first time, a quiet evening after a long meeting. It wasn't planned. It wasn't calculated. He simply looked at her, saw the way her eyes softened when she smiled and leaned in, and when she didn't pull away, when she kissed him back with a tenderness that felt both fierce and gentle, he knew his world had shifted permanently. The billionaire who once swore he'd never look at a black woman with anything more than indifference was falling fast, and for the first time in his life he wasn't afraid of the fall. Love wasn't something Maverick Knight had ever trusted. He had seen it used as a bargaining chip, a mask, a weakness. In his world of billion-dollar deals and ruthless negotiations, love was an illusion, sweet, dangerous, and fleeting. But with Pheobe Bernard, it wasn't an illusion. It was undeniable, real, and terrifying in its intensity. What began as friendship had bloomed into something richer. Their stolen evenings turned into weekends together. Their meetings, once confined to business, became adventures of discovery. Maverick found himself learning the rhythms of her life, the way she hummed softly when concentrating, the way she always ordered tea instead of coffee, the way her laughter, unrestrained and genuine, echoed long after it faded. Phoebe, in turn, saw a Maverick no one else had ever witnessed. She saw the man behind the empire, the boy who once sought his father's approval and never received it, the man who craved silence after a day of power. She saw his flaws, his stubbornness, his sharp temper, his occasional arrogance, but she also saw his tenderness, the quiet way he reached for her hand when no one was watching. They were falling deeply, undeniably in love. But love, especially love that broke barriers, never came without resistance. The media caught on quickly. Maverick Knight, elusive, untouchable bachelor, was suddenly appearing at galas with Pheobe Bernard on his arm. Cameras flashed, headlines screamed, gossip columns speculated. Knight's new flame. Bernard heiress or business move. Society shocked as Maverick Knight dates outside his type power couple or publicity stunt. Some applauded them, many didn't. And then there was his past. One crisp autumn evening, Maverick found himself face to face with Elena Moore, his ex-girlfriend. Tall, blonde, and striking, Elena had always been the kind of woman the world expected him to be with. They met at a charity event, and Elena wasted no time making her move. "Maverick," she purred, her red lips curving in a practiced smile. "Imagine my surprise seeing you with her." His jaw tightened. "What do you want, Elena?" "Just to remind you," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "that people like us belong together. Do you really think your board, your investors, even your society friends will take you seriously with someone like Pheobe? He stepped closer, his voice low, dangerous. If you ever speak her name with that tone again, you'll regret it. Do I make myself clear? Elena faltered, her confidence cracking under the icy fire in his eyes. But the damage was done. Maverick couldn't shake the anger, not at her, but at himself, because once, he would have agreed with her. That night, as he sat in Phoebe's apartment, he confessed the truth. There was a time, he said quietly, staring at the floor, when I would have dismissed you, not because of who you are, but because of the color of your skin. I would have told myself we were too different, that it could never work. Phoebe was silent, her eyes searching his face. And now? She asked finally. He met her gaze, his voice steady. Now I know I was a fool. Because you are everything I didn't know I needed. You're strong, brilliant, beautiful, and I'd burn down the world before I let anyone take you from me. For a long moment she just looked at him. Then she crossed the room, cupped his face in her hands and whispered, "Don't burn down the world, Maverick. Just promise me you'll stand with me in it." And he promised. Their courtship became the stuff of whispered legend. They traveled together, not just to exotic islands and private villas, but to places that mattered. They visited orphanages Phoebe supported, schools her foundation funded. Maverick, who had once written checks without caring where they went, began to see the impact of compassion through her eyes. They shared intimate nights cooking in her small kitchen, where Maverick, hopeless at chopping vegetables, ended up burning the onions while Phoebe laughed until she cried. They took long drives through the countryside, where silence was as comfortable as conversation. And through it all, Maverick softened. Not weakly, not passively, but with a strength that came from knowing he didn't have to face the world alone. Still, the challenges persisted. An article surfaced, accusing Phoebe of only being with Maverick for his money. Another painted Maverick as a man experimenting with novelty, destined to discard her. The scrutiny was relentless. One night, after a particularly vicious article, Phoebe sat on her balcony, her arms wrapped around herself. "Maybe this was a mistake," she whispered. "Maybe the world will never see us for who we are." Maverick knelt in front of her, his hands on her knees, his eyes fierce. "I don't give a damn what the world sees, I see you. That's enough for me." "But is it enough for us?" she asked softly. He didn't answer with words. Instead, he kissed her with a desperation that told her everything she needed to know. The turning point came when Maverick chose to make a public stand. At a major business conference during a QA session, a journalist asked bluntly, "Mr. Knight, what do you say to critics who claim your relationship with Ms. Bernard is a mistake?" The room went silent. Cameras flashed. Maverick looked straight into the lens and said, "The only mistake I ever made was not seeing her worth sooner. Pheobe Bernard is not just my partner in life. She's a leader, a visionary, and the woman I love. If anyone has a problem with that, they can take it up with me." The applause that followed was thunderous. And though controversy didn't vanish overnight, the statement marked a line in the sand. Maverick Knight had chosen his side, and it was with Phoebe. It was only months later, on a quiet evening, that Maverick decided he couldn't wait any longer. They were at her favorite spot by the river, the city lights twinkling on the water. Phoebe leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder, content. Maverick reached into his pocket, his heart pounding in a way it never had in boardrooms or battles. "Phoebe," he began, his voice uncharacteristically uncertain. She looked up at him, curiosity in her eyes. "I spent my life thinking love was weakness, that letting someone close would cost me everything. But then you came, and you showed me that love isn't weakness. It's the strongest thing I've ever known. I don't want to face a single day without you by my side." He pulled out the velvet box, opening it to reveal a diamond ring that sparkled like the stars above. "Will you marry me?" For once, Pheobe Bernard, eloquent, unshakable Pheobe, was speechless. Tears filled her eyes as she whispered, "Yes, 1,000 times yes." Their wedding was grand but intimate, a paradox only they could pull off. The cathedral was filled with roses and orchids, the pews lined with family, friends, and leaders from around the world. Maverick stood at the altar in a tailored black tuxedo, his heart racing as the doors opened. And there she was, Pheobe, radiant in white satin and lace, walking toward him like a vision. The entire world seemed to fade, leaving only her. When she reached him, Maverick took her hands, his voice steady as he spoke his vows. "I once lived in a world of walls built of pride and prejudice, but you broke them down with nothing more than your grace, your strength, and your love. From this day forward, I am yours, completely, unconditionally, eternally." Phoebe's voice trembled as she replied, "You once feared love, Maverick, but you gave me yours, and I'll spend my life proving you were right to trust it. I choose you, today, tomorrow, and always." When they kissed, the cathedral erupted in applause. As they danced that night under a canopy of stars, Maverick realized the truth. He hadn't just found love. He had found redemption. The billionaire who once dismissed black women had fallen irrevocably in love with one. And in loving her, he had discovered not only his heart, but his humanity. For Maverick and Pheobe, love had not just conquered prejudice, it had conquered everything. And it was only the beginning. Thank you so much for watching and supporting my channel. Your love, comments, and shares mean everything to me. Grateful for each of you. Let's keep growing together. With love from Whispers of Hope.